If you have your Bible, you can open up to Ephesians chapter 6. That's where we're going to spend our time this morning. I always like to start as often as I can with a little bit of participation. You've been around for very long. You know I like to have you participate instead of you just sitting there. So I want to ask you a question. What was, or for some of you that are still in school, what is your favorite school subject when you were growing up as a kid? Do we have anybody that says English, or maybe reading, something like that? That was your favorite? Both of you, great. That's good. That's awesome. Anybody that science was your favorite subject or is your favorite subject? All right, very good. Do we have any history people? History, you liked history? Okay, fewer this service than last service. What about the arts? Maybe it was music or actually just art classes, anything like that, theater? Okay, how about recess, lunch, PE, anybody? That was mine. That was mine for sure. But out of all the ones that actually are considered classes, how about math? Anybody math people? Hey, that's my people right there. I like it. I actually liked math. Out of those kind of subjects, math was one of my favorites. And one of the reasons is because I loved formulas. Now, there's a lot of different equations, and you got to solve for x, and E equals mc squared, and stuff like that. But I loved formulas. Like if you wanted to find the length of a side of a triangle, right, you were going to use the Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus equals c squared. Good. Some people still remember these things. That's great. Or actually, that might have just been the kids that are learning it right now. I don't know. And if you wanted to find the area in a circle, it's pi times radius squared, right? Anybody know the numbers of pi? 3.14. Yeah. Yeah, I knew 3.14. That was as far as I ever got. Some people can do it forever and just keep going. I don't understand that. But as I got into college, I took some finance classes, some business finance, personal finance, stuff like that. And I started learning about interest and formulas for interest. And you can look at the principal and then take the rate of interest and the amount of time and all that kind of stuff. And then compounding interest, which hopefully some of us in the room understand compounding interest. And I loved formulas because what I loved about formulas is I could put in, as long as I had the right numbers that I input, then I would get the right output, right? And formulas would give you that information. And it was put together so beautifully that there was a formula and I could put in the right numbers and I knew I was going to get the right output. Now, anybody in the room wish, maybe you're a parent today and you wish there was a formula for raising kids that was like that? Oh yeah, sweet Jesus, right? I just heard that up front, right? Like that's what we wish that there was just some kind of formula. But the reality is there is no formula for raising kids because all kids are completely different. Now, we're going to talk about raising kids, and just as we talked about when we talked about marriage, last week was about singleness. Every single week, you might say, well, I'm not a parent. You might say, I don't plan on being a parent or anything like that. I want you to know this stuff can still apply to you. It's important for all of us in the room to still understand these things because all of us are going to come across parents. All of us are going to have friends maybe that are parents. All of us are going to have people around us that it's important for us to have this context and this biblical understanding, even if we're not parents. So even if you're not a parent or you don't plan on being one, I want you to listen today. But I loved formulas because they always gave the right output. When it comes to parenting, though, there's some issues that create where we don't have formulas that work perfectly for every single person. That's because the dynamics and all the variables can change on the inputs, so the output can look different. I'm one of 4 kids. I'm the third of 4 kids in my household. We all grew up in the same house, same parents, had the same rules and all that kind of stuff, but all 4 of us, siblings, are quite a bit different. We came with a lot of the same inputs, but there's a whole lot of variables along the way that change. Now, when you think about parenting, it can be a wild ride. It can be a really wild ride because those variables always change. You think about things like you've got immaturity, you've got exhaustion, you've got anxiety, you've got stress, you've got hormones, all these different things that are changing at all times. And I'm just talking about the parents, right? I'm not even talking about the kids yet. All these variables start to change, and so all of a sudden, the inputs start to change, the variables on the front side, and so therefore the outputs can start to look different. But even though that's true, we can still see some very clear biblical principles and priorities that we need to be putting into place. If you're a follower of Jesus, these are really important. Even if you're not a follower of Jesus, you could put some of these things into place. And it's really important for us to understand as parents that these need to be our priorities in parenting. Now, I have a different type of experience than many people in this room. If you're in education, maybe yours looks a little bit different, but before my wife and I had kids, we spent 4 years, and a little bit more than that, but 4 years in student ministry where we were working with high school students mostly and their families. And so we had this kind of unique perspective when we entered into parenting once we had our first child. But we all know this, but everybody in the room is an expert in parenting until you have your own kids, right? Everybody knows that. If you have kids, you know what it's like. You remember the days that before you had kids, you'd get on an airplane and there was a little baby crying and you would think, what is wrong with those parents? Just shut the kid up, right? Like that's what you'd think. And then you have kids and you're in an airplane and you're like, there's really nothing I could do. And then after that, now all of a sudden you don't have little babies and you're in an airplane and somebody's got a crying kid. You're like, I wish they could shut that kid up, but I get it, right? Like we all know, because now that you've been through it, you know it's a lot different. But that doesn't mean your perspective before having kids was completely off. It just means that now you know some things you didn't know before. Now we have 3 kids. Our oldest is 13 years old. Our daughter in the middle just turned 9 this week, a couple days ago. And then our baby boy is 6 years old already. And he'll be 7 in a few months. So we've been through a few stages now of parenting. We haven't been through all of them. We got much more to go, and we have way more we need to learn. We've learned a lot in parenting. I've learned a lot in parenting, and I have a long way to go. So I want you to know I'm not an expert. Even I did student ministry for 17 years, worked with junior high and high school students and their families, and even a little bit younger and sometimes a little bit older because they kind of came in early or stuck around a little bit longer. So I have a lot of experience in this area, but I'm not an expert by any means. Nobody, I don't think, can be considered an expert in every single part of it, but I'm not an expert, but I know some things, and I've got a long way to go in my learning. But here's the thing. One of the things I know about every single person in this room and every single parent in this room is we're all imperfect. All of us are imperfect. There are no perfect parents. Now, I'm glad my son, who's over here, did not say amen, right? Because I know that I'm not a perfect parent, but my goal is to try to strive to be better. We've been talking about being better in marriage, being better spouses. Today, we're going to talk about being better parents. A couple weeks ago, like I said, we talked about Ephesians chapter 5 about submission and love, right? Wives, submit to your husbands. Husbands, love your wives. And there's a pattern that we follow as we look into Ephesians chapter 6. There's a pattern. He says, wives, submit to your husbands in chapter 5. But husbands, you need to love your wife. And then in chapter 6, he says, children, obey your parents. And then it talks about what parents should do as the leader in the household. And it kind of continues down this pattern. But we're going to see today 3 priorities and principles of parenting that we need to have in place. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 4. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger by the way you treat them. Rather, bring them up with the discipline and instruction that comes from the Lord. We're going to focus in and unpack that one verse. Do not provoke your children to anger by the way you treat them. Rather, bring them up with the discipline and instruction that comes from the Lord. I want to give a little background before we get too far into this so we understand this generation. Like I said, in a lot of my time as a parent, but even more probably studied this in a way that maybe I wouldn't have if I wasn't in student ministry for a long time. I've spent a lot of time studying this generation of people. Now, I'm not just talking about millennials, which started in about 1980, even though there's kind of a gap version there, but I'm talking about the generation that probably is about 25 years and younger right now. About 25 years and younger, maybe a little bit older than 25 years. But there's a guy named Tim Elmore who is a leader of a group called Growing Leaders, and he talks about the scene that's set for this generation. But before we look at the scene and the way the world is set up for this generation, I want us to understand something. One of the things I want us to understand is this is the first generation in history that has not needed adults to pass on information to them. The generation that is currently growing up is the first generation that has not needed adults to pass on information to them because they can find any information they want on the internet. They have it readily accessible. Now, you might say, well, what about books? Books passed on information, but they didn't have every book accessible at all times. They have every bit of information accessible at all times. And we know, parents, that this is a great thing that they can find all the information they want on the internet. Because as Abraham Lincoln said, you should always trust everything you see on the internet. It's all completely true and extremely reliable. I found it on the internet. Abraham Lincoln said that, and we know that this is so important and so true that they can find, and it's a great thing. Now, we know that's ridiculous, right? They can find a whole lot of information, but they might not need us for all the information anymore, but here's what they do need adults for context and for instruction, a way to filter and decipher and give discernment for that information. They need us to help interpret the information. And by the way, every one of us needs this as a reality. I mean, in the world we live in right now, it's not just kids that are being fed the garbage and stuff like that. Every single one of us all the time are being fed a whole lot of garbage, and we need wisdom, discernment. We need to understand context, and we need wisdom to understand how we should interpret information anytime it comes at us, because we don't have to seek information anymore. It seeks us. People are trying to seek you out with information. They're trying to put information into your brain. You don't have to go seek it. And so what we have to do is we have to be able to filter it and interpret it along the way. So here's the scene that Tim Elmore talks about. By the way, if you're a parent of a teen or a preteen, I would encourage you to check out his stuff. It's some of the greatest stuff I've seen in a long, long time. Tim Elmore of Growing Leaders. But he says this world is full of a couple things. Now, I use the word scene, S-C-E-N-E, and he uses one letter for each thing. The first is he says the world is full of speed. The world is full of speed. We have Instagram, we have Snapchat, right? We have high-speed internet. You think about your phone just a few years ago, if you had 3G, you had the fastest thing you could have. Then it went to 4G, then it was 4G LTE, and now it's 5G, right? Now you think, if I had 3G right now, I don't know what I would do with my life. Like I would just end it, I'd throw my phone down and break it all the time. But just a few years ago, that was like the fastest thing you had. That's how rapidly things are changing. And speed, by the way, is a good thing. It's not a bad thing. It can be a good thing, but here's what he says. He says, because they live in a world full of speed, a lot of times this generation can assume, not everybody, not all the time, but they can assume that slow is bad. That things that are slow are bad. He says another thing, the world is full of convenience, that everything's easy and accessible. Listen, if you need any information, it's not just that you can find it, you can just say, hey Siri, and ask Siri a question. Alexa, and ask Alexa the question, right? It's really convenient and really easy, and a lot of times that's a good thing. And because convenience can be a good thing, a lot of times we can assume that hard is bad. He says that one of the most common phrases used, one of the most common things said by this generation when it comes to anything that's remotely difficult is, the number one statement is, this is too hard. That phrase comes out of the mouth of this generation more than previous generations, because convenience is all around at all times. Easy is around at all times. Therefore, it can be hard. This is too hard comes out. Another one is entertainment. That there's a constant stream of videos. You got Instagram stories, you got TikTok videos, TikTok challenges, all these kinds of things that are constantly bombarding, constantly in their hands, not just around them, but in their hands at all times. And so they can start to think that even though, by the way, entertainment can be a good thing, they can start to think that boring is bad. That boring is bad. Do you know that neuroscientists say that boredom creates space for two things that are really, really important? The first is creativity, and the second, probably more important, is empathy. That boredom, neuroscientists say that boredom creates space for creativity and for empathy. That's an important thing for us to have. And the next one is nurture. How many of you came home from the hospital when you were born and you were in a car seat? Yeah, I didn't think so. None of the adults raised their hand because we weren't in a car seat. I remember when I was a little kid traveling, I would lay down on the window, behind the back seat and sleep baking in the sun on a road trip, right? Laying down back there. And now, before I pull out of my driveway, I'm like, kids, get your seatbelt on. They live in this world. And by the way, that's not a bad thing. It's a good thing, but what we've created, because they grow up in a generation of car seats, seatbelts, and airbags, they're always avoiding risks, and as parents, we're always trying to protect them, and in some ways, that can be a great thing. But Tim Elmore says that we've created the most risk-averse generation in the history of the world. They can assume that because nurture is a good thing, and it is a good thing, that risk is bad. And he said this, he kind of looked at it and he said this. He said it's created a highly arrogant generation with low self-esteem. One of the most arrogant generations with the least amount of self-esteem, because it's really easy to get likes and friends and views and things like that. The next thing he said kind of ties to this as well. It's entitlement. The final E is entitlement, that I deserve success and rewards. Now, by the way, being human, there's certain things that all of us deserve and have rights to and things like that. All of us should be treated with respect and kindness and love and things like that. That we're entitled to those things. We might not always get them, but all of us should be giving those things to people freely because they're human beings. That's what we should be giving. But what happens is this entitlement level of all it takes is my participation and I should get rewarded for that. That if I'm a part of anything, I should get rewarded. It shouldn't be based on any of my effort or output or anything like that. And so he said, this generation gets trophies and ribbons for putting the dishes in the sink, basically, is the way he describes it. But think about all those words that are bad words: slow, hard, boring, risk, and labor. That those things are bad, and as a whole, that this generation can start to look at those things and see those things as bad. Those things, those words actually are words and things that build character and maturity. Because parents, we want our kids to understand that, you know what, you're going to have to work hard. And sometimes it's going to be boring. And you're going to have to risk something. And you're going to have to labor and all these kinds of things. And it might take a long time. You might not get an immediate reward for what you're trying to do. But if you're willing to go through it and put in the work and put in a little bit of risk and keep going, even when it's boring, even when it's hard, even when it's slow and takes some time, that you're going to see the results in the end. We want our kids to learn that. So what are some of the things that we can do to build into, with that understanding of this generation? What are some of the things we can come alongside them from a biblical perspective? Now, this picture, this verse that we're looking at doesn't answer specifically all of those questions, but here's what it does. It puts us as parents in the right spot to be able to answer all those questions for them, to help them move them the right direction so that in their lives they get to answer all of those things. So Ephesians chapter 6, verse 4, with that context and that background of this generation, says, fathers, it can be translated as parents, fathers, do not provoke or exasperate your children to anger by the way you treat them. Colossians chapter 3 says it this way: do not exasperate your children so they will not lose heart. Now, again, this can be translated parents. Tony Evans says it can be translated parents, but it cannot be translated government or village or school system. This is because the onus of raising kingdom kids is on the parents. So what does it mean to exasperate your children? What does it mean to provoke them to anger? Here's a couple things. It means to drive them to be angry, overloaded, or overwhelmed unnecessarily. And here's some of the ways we do that. One is by disrespecting them with our words and actions. The things we do with our words and actions. Now remember, none of us are perfect. I'm not perfect. I get it wrong, maybe more than I get it right. All of us are imperfect, but some of us do this at times. We overwhelm them and overload them unnecessarily, maybe by disrespecting them with our words and actions. Another one is by comparing them to other kids. Maybe you compare them to your own kids, other kids, or maybe by other kids where you say, well, did you see what they did? Can you just do what they did? Can you just be more like them? That's an unnecessary burden. Showing favoritism, being critical of everything, unrealistic expectations. Here's one that I think is really common today, is setting them up with negative thoughts about the future. It's really easy to go, man, our world is crazy and your world is going to be a mess when you grow up and stuff like that. That's an overwhelming, overloaded burden that they should not be carrying, because parents, guess what? The reality is the world is kind of crazy, and it has been for a really long time, but God is still sovereign. And that's what we need to be teaching our kids, is that God is still in control, and God is not shocked or overwhelmed by any of this, and God is still in control. It doesn't mean that he's making everything happen because we choose to do our own things and go our own ways, right? He doesn't puppet everything that happens, but he is not shocked by anything that's happening. And we need to be teaching our kids not just that the world is crazy, but that God is in control. Another way that people can overwhelm and overload their kids is when kids feel like they have no idea what can make their parents happy. Some of us, I think at times, even myself, maybe at times, I might have times where my kids are like, I don't even know what can make you happy. Have you ever been in a relationship where you tried to do something and you thought that would make the person happy and they had the exact opposite response? If you're married, you probably know what this is like, right? If you've ever been in a work relationship, you probably know what this is like, where you're literally thinking, the only reason I'm doing this is because I think that will make my boss happy, my wife happy, my husband happy, whatever. You start thinking, the only reason I'm doing this is to make them happy, and they respond exactly the opposite. But what if that's a consistent thing that your kids are trying to do what they think you want them to do, and you're constantly unhappy, you're constantly overloading them? Paul says, and he says, do not provoke or exasperate or overwhelm your children to make them angry. All these things can be so discouraging for kids. So let's go the other way with it and say, here's one of the first things that we need to do as parents, and I'll go through these real quick. The first is that we need to encourage our children. Not just don't discourage them, but we need to encourage our children. Not for what they do, but for who they are. Parents, find ways to encourage your children. If you see that your kid is constantly doing things bad, let me encourage you to find something that they're doing good and encourage them in that. If you feel like, man, I just feel like I'm getting down on my kid all the time, then that's okay. You might have reasons to be kind of shaping them and directing them, but find a way where you can say something positive, you can say something encouraging and say, hey, I know that you're doing a lot of things wrong, but I'm proud of you for doing that right. You might not have to set it up that way, but you're like, hey, thank you for picking up that piece of trash that you dropped on the floor so that somebody else doesn't have to do it. And you might say, that's ridiculous. It might be ridiculous, but you might have to choose something ridiculous. But just find something that you can encourage them in. Say words like, you can do it, I believe in you, don't give up. Things we need to say to our kids. Tell them you love them. Some of you might have grown up in a house where your mom or dad never said, I love you. Another thing is tell them you're proud of them. Now again, don't pretend. Find something you're proud of them for and tell them you're proud of them. Being in student ministry for a long time, I can't tell you how many times I talked to a kid, put my hand on their shoulder, I said, I'm really proud of you. And I just see tears streaming down their face. So I've never heard that before. Happened so many times where I would talk to a kid who said, I've never had anybody say that to me before. Tell your kids you love them. Tell them you're proud of them. If you grew up in a house that you didn't get it, then guess what? You can create a household that you actually give it. Tell them you love them. Tell them you're proud of them. Encourage your kids. The next it says, bring them up with the discipline and instruction that comes from the Lord. The second thing is to discipline our children. We need to discipline our children. Now, there's two extremes. There's the ultra permissiveness, which the first verse, instead of saying, children, obey your parents, the modern version that we see all the time would have said, parents, obey your children, for this will keep them happy and bring peace to the home, right? That's what a lot of people in this generation are experiencing, this ultra permissiveness. And then there's another side to it, the over discipline, that everything is a big deal and everything is always controlled. Parents, we know this. Not everything is a big deal. There are some things that are absolutely a big deal. Not everything is a big deal. And sometimes we can treat everything like it's a big deal. What happens when we go to those extremes, when we live in those extremes? Now, all of us, again, might have bad tendencies one way or the other, but when we live in those extremes, those two extremes create the exact same thing, extreme insecurity in the kids. That's what those two things create. So when you discipline your children, you might have to use a variety. One of my kids, if I say, go to your room, that's like the greatest thing I could ever give them, right? That's not a punishment for them because they love spending time in their room. They go in their room and just play and play and play. So we've got to change our form of how I'm going to discipline. But here's what I would say. No matter what you do, if you're going to discipline, always discipline in love, never in anger. Discipline in love, not in anger, because when we lose control, we lose our kids. Howard Hendricks says this, the secret of a disciplined child is a disciplined parent. And flying off the handle never creates a better child or a better parent. So how do we discipline? I want to encourage you to think in terms of equation, not rules. A plus B equals C. Attitude plus behavior equals consequences. You have a good attitude and you have good behavior, then guess what? Good consequences come. But you have a bad attitude, even if you do the right thing, you can have bad consequences. You have a good attitude, but you do the wrong thing, you're still going to have consequences. Now, all those things might look a little different in every different scenario, but attitude plus behavior, I got to do the right thing the right way with the right attitude, and I got to do it right away, right? That's the picture. We need to help our kids understand those kind of boundaries and teach them to obey with honor. There's an old statement that is attributed to a whole lot of different people, but I think it probably comes from a Native American proverb. It says, we must prepare the child for the path, not the path for the child. Because we have a lot of parents that are constantly trying to change the boundaries for their kids over and over again. And they're going this way, so I'm just going to change the boundaries. I'm going to let them outside. No, we got to prepare them for the path ahead. And then the last one, Ephesians chapter 6, verse 4, bring them up with the discipline and instruction that comes from the Lord. The last one is to instruct your children, or I'll say it a different way, disciple your children. We need to discipline our children, and we need to disciple our children. This is, I think, the most important thing we can do as parents. We need to discipline them. We need to encourage them. And all of these are a part of discipling our children, because the goal in parenting is not that they would get a good education, a good job, a good spouse, a good home, a good life from all like outside perspective, because we all know that there are a whole lot of people around us that have all those things and they're empty on the inside. We all know people that are like that, and maybe some of us in the room, you might say that's actually where I'm at right now. I might have all the things, but I'm empty on the inside. The number one goal of parenting is to see kids grow up to love God with all their heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love others. To love God and to love others. And this kind of discipleship only comes with training through relationship. If you're a parent in this room, or you're going to become a parent someday, there is no more important thing we could pass on to our children, and there are no more important people that we can pass this stuff on to than our next generation, our own children, the truth of God's word and the value of his plan. We need to be people that are doing that. But here's the thing. You can't pass what you don't have. You can't pass what you don't have. If the number one goal of parenting is to raise kids, to help kids to grow to love God with all their heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love other people, if we don't have that, we can't pass it on. Like I said, I grew up playing sports, and guess what? The thing about football, if you're a quarterback, you're not going to make a pass if you don't take the snap and get it into your hands, right? Baseball, if you don't field the ball first, you have nothing to throw to the first baseman to get anybody out. You can't pass what you don't have. Parents, we can't pass what we don't have. And your kids, as parents, our kids need to see us having a life where we love God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and we love other people. And when we have that, it's something that we can pass on to them. We have to live what we want them to learn. Parents, if we're kind, they're going to learn kindness. If we're generous, they're going to learn generosity. If we apologize, our kids will learn how to apologize. Parents, we need to apologize to our kids sometimes. Anybody ever gotten really frustrated with your kids and maybe blew up at them, or maybe even disciplined them or said something out of anger? You need to apologize to your kids if that happens. We need to be people who apologize. They'll learn to do the same thing. We want our kids to to grow up learning to do those things. Howard Hendricks says, God didn't give us kids so they could depend on us. He gave us kids so we would depend on him. There's one way to do it right. Proverbs chapter 3, verse 5 and 6. Parents says, trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, that he will make your paths straight. It's a high calling to be a parent. And listen, I realize there's some people in here who are not parents, but let me encourage you, this is still important for you, again, to understand, because you're going to come alongside people, you're going to come alongside kids who don't have parents like this, who still need you to maybe step in and fill in some of these roles for them. It's really difficult. It's extremely difficult in this generation. This is the first generation of people that no parent is able to say, I know exactly what you're going through. The first time that we don't understand everything exactly what they're going through, but we don't have to. What we have to do is we have to love our kids, we have to encourage our kids, we have to discipline our kids, and we have to disciple them to pass on what we have, but we've got to have it first. If you want to know how to do it, you got to trust in the Lord with all your hearts. Lean not on your own understanding. In everything we do, to know him, to know God, to spend time in his word, to know what he wants for my life so that I can know what he wants for my kids' life. To acknowledge him in everything, and he'll make our path straight. He'll lay it out before you. He'll give you wisdom. Parents, if you're overwhelmed, God will give you the wisdom you need. This is the highest calling and one of the greatest responsibilities of our lives if you're a parent. To pass on the reality and the truth of God's word and a love for God to the next generation. Now, I want to say it again. The variables are all different. You can have two kids that grow up in the same home. One ends up loving God, and the other one goes astray. They still have to make personal choices. There are personal choices they have to make. And so what I'm not saying is if your kid maybe ran off in their own way, or maybe they're off at college, or maybe they're an adult and they're running their own way, I'm not saying you did it wrong. But what I am saying is we have an opportunity, parents, no matter how old your kids or grown kids are, to love our kids, to encourage them, to discipline them for a long season, but to always disciple them. And just to see what God might do as we pass on what God's doing in us. It has to start there to the next generation for his glory.